All right. Well, thank you all. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute here at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. We're thrilled today to have Bill Browder, the co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management in 1996. He advised the largest foreign investment. It's been the largest foreign investment or advised the largest foreign investment fund in Russia since 2000 until about 2005. Bill is a fighter against corruption. As he was engaged in this effort against corruption, he was denied entry into Russia. He was declared a threat to national security. His offices were raided, and of course, as many people know, his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky was involved in the effort, was helping him get out of it, and was ultimately taken in by the Russian authorities. He was beaten. He was held against his will, and ultimately died in his cell in November 2009. That changed Bill's life. He's going to talk to us about it today. And Bill, while he continues to be a force in the financial world, has become an activist on issues related to human rights and related to the treatment of individuals, particularly when it comes to human rights issues in Russia as well as across the globe. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller Red Notice, which recounts his experience. It's Red Notice, a story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. So, Bill, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Glad to be here. Good to see you.
So, Bill, let's just jump right into it. Talk to us start at the beginning, right? So you didn't intend to become a human rights crusader. You were in finance. Tell us about what you were doing in Russia. How did you come to be in Russia? Have a business, $4.5 billion of funds of assets under management at one time. Talk to us about how you arrived at that, and then what transpired after. So let's start at the beginning. How did you end up in Russia? Managing billions of dollars.
Well, it all comes from a family rebellion. I come from a very strange American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was a labor union organizer in the 1920s. And he was so good at organizing the unions that the communists spotted him and said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism.
Right.
Why don't you come to Russia and check it out? And so in 1927, Earl Browder, my grandfather, moved to Moscow. He did what many other single red-blooded American men do when they get to Moscow. He met a Russian girl who became my grandmother. My father was born there. And then 5 years later, in 1932, he returned to America and became the general secretary of the American Communist Party. Wow. And he ran for president against Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 41, pardoned in 42. He was then kicked out of the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then persecuted viciously during the McCarthy era for having been the head of the Communist Party. And so this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 57 years old. But when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out this way of rebelling from a family of communists. And I came up with this great idea, which is to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist.
Right.
And so I became a capitalist. I enrolled at Stanford Business School in 1987, and I graduated 2 years later in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down.
Right.
And I had this epiphany one day, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe.
In Russia. Right.
And that's what I set out to do. And I succeeded. I ended up setting up an investment fund. It was called the Hermitage Fund. Managing money of Western institutions and private investors, and in the Russian stock market. Started with nothing, and it eventually grew to become a $4.5 billion behemoth in the Russian market. And that was during the good days. Everything was pretty great then. The problem was that I discovered that everything I owned in Russia was basically being robbed. If you owned a company in Russia, you didn't really own a share of that company because all the money was being looted out the back door by corrupt oligarchs and corrupt officials. And so I was really in kind of a bind because if I didn't do anything about it, then I was basically going to end up with nothing. And so I came up with this idea, which was that to research how these people stole the money. And then share that research with the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the Washington Post, et cetera. Doing kind of what I call naming and shaming campaigns for these against these guys.
Yeah.
And for a brief period of time, not even brief, for a reasonable period of time, it actually worked for a very strange reason, because the time that I started to name and shame the oligarchs was right around the time that Vladimir Putin had just come to power.
Okay.
And everyone thinks of Putin as being some kind of like, just sort of totally powerful, evil genius. But when he first came to power, he was not all that powerful. He was president of the presidential administration of Russia, but not even president of Russia, because all the powers of the presidency had been usurped by these oligarchs. And so we had this strange alignment of interests at the time, because he was trying to regain the power of the presidency, and which was stolen by the oligarchs, and I was trying to get the oligarchs to stop stealing my money. And so I would do these exposés on these oligarchs, and Putin would come in on my side, and I've never met the guy. We've never had a conversation. To this day, I have not had a conversation with Putin. But there's this expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And and that applied to my situation with Putin perfectly, because and so every time I would put a big expose out there, he would come in with like a ton of bricks on whoever I was exposing. And what would happen after that was the share price would go up. And so
good for investors.
It was pretty great all around. So there I was, making money hand over fist for my investors. I got a percentage of that. And I was making Russia a better place, because we were cracking down on corruption. And for that period of time, for that period of time, I thought Putin was a good guy. The problem was that he wasn't doing this because he wanted to make Russia a better place or a more honest place. He was doing this because he didn't like the oligarchs, and
he wanted his oligarchs in power.
Well, he wanted to be the biggest oligarch, and he went for broke in 2003. He arrested the richest oligarch in Russia. He was a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He owned an oil company called Yukos, and he arrested him off of his private jet in Siberia. Khodorkovsky had landed in Siberia. Putin's got his secret policeman from the FSB to surround his plane. They grabbed him. They brought him back to Moscow. Then they put him on trial. And in Russia, when you go on trial, there's a 99.7% chance you're going to be convicted. And so as a result, there's really no presumption of innocence. And because of that, they just put you in a cage, because that's where you're going to end up afterwards. And so they put Khodorkovsky in a cage. And then they allowed the television cameras to come in and film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now, imagine you're the 17th richest guy in Russia. You're on your yacht. You're parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes, France. Maybe you finished up with your mistress in the bedroom. You kind of pad out to the living room. You flick on CNN, and there you see a guy far richer, far more powerful, far better than you, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage yourself. And so one by one, the oligarchs went to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? And he said, it's real simple, 50%. And this was not 50% for the Russian government or for anything. This is 50% for Vladimir Putin. And at that moment in time, Putin became the richest man in the world. And at that moment in time, all of my alignment of interests were no longer aligned. And so as I started to name and shame oligarchs after that, I was also naming and shaming Putin's 50% financial interest. And it didn't take them too long to decide that they didn't want that happening anymore.
So what happens next? How do you end up being persona non grata in Russia? They had some tax charges against you. Talk to us about that, and then talk to us about how you get involved with Sergei Magnitsky.
So what happened was on November 13th, 2005, I was flying back to Moscow after a business trip to London. Sunday night, I get on the airplane. And when I arrive in Moscow, and I've done this trip like 200 times before, I've been living there for 10 years. I'm at the VIP lounge, which is a place where you're supposed to be treated pretty well. get through pretty quickly. And they keep me waiting there for about an hour. And finally, as I'm really starting to get impatient, 4 heavily armed border guards barge into the lounge, grab me, and then frog march me down to the detention center of the airport, where I'm then held overnight. And then the next day, they deport me to London and declare me a threat to national security, which, by the way, is like the luckiest thing that ever happened, because this was back in the days when Putin still, didn't have the kind of brazenness that he has right now.
Right.
And,
you didn't want to go. You didn't want to go to that prison at KGB headquarters, right?
I didn't want to go to Lubyanka
or Lubyanka, right,
or Siberia, or even worse, with a lead bullet in my skull. Right. And so being kicked out, was not great for business. I was managing an investment fund in Russia, but I understood that it was a pretty mild sanction compared to what they could have done.
Sure.
And so I then said to myself, what could they do? And the answer was they could arrest my people, or they could seize all of my assets. And so I organized an urgent evacuation of all my people and their families, and I got everybody out. And then after everyone was out, we quickly and quietly liquidated all of the securities we held in Russia, and we got everything out.
The entire, all $4.5 billion.
Got every last dollar that we held in Russia out of the country. And so I thought, okay, that was pretty dramatic. I'll be, writing about that in a book someday, and I'll move on to some other things. And so I set up another investment fund to work in other parts of the world and sort of carry on my business. And then 18 months after, and the only thing I did keep was I kept the office in Moscow, under the assumption that maybe one day it'll all blow over. And so I had one secretary there. And so about 18 months after I was expelled, I get a call from the secretary. She's in hysterics. And I had never hear from her because what do I need to talk? I mean, it's just, and I say, what's wrong? And she said, there's 25 police officers raiding the office right now. Now, what should I do? I said, I don't know. Let me call up my lawyer. So I've got a lawyer in Moscow, an American lawyer. I call him up and I say, there's 25 police officers raiding my office. What should I do? And he says, he sounded pretty distracted. He said, well, there's 25 officers raiding my office right now looking for your documents. Let me get back to you. And so basically they were conducting a joint raid of my office, my lawyer's office. They were looking for the official stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies. These were the companies to which we had invested our money in Russia, which were empty at this point. Remember, I've just sold everything. And so they're empty companies. They didn't know that. They seized these documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. The documents that were seized by the police were then used to fraudulently re-register our investment holding companies. And at this point, I was pretty worried, not because we were losing any money, but I was worried that if the police were, raiding our offices and stealing our companies, I'm going to be walking through some airport one day in Frankfurt and get picked up, grabbed. And so we hired the smartest lawyer we knew in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, to help us unravel this this fraud, to stop it, to figure it out, and to stop it. And so
get the holding companies back.
Well, just to stop whatever they were doing. I mean, to get the holding companies back and figure out what else was going on, because it was not just that. And so Sergey starts to investigate. He discovers it wasn't just the theft of our companies, but they had used these companies, these investment holding companies, to go back to the tax authorities. And just a little sidebar, after we sold everything in Russia, we had a huge profit. In the previous year, when we sold everything, we had a huge profit. We had a $1 billion of profit. And on that profit, we paid to the Russian government $230 million of capital gains tax. And what Sergey had discovered from his investigation was that the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities on the 2 days before Christmas, the 23rd of December, and they applied for a $230 million tax refund, the amount of taxes that we had paid. And that $230 million tax refund, which, by the way, was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, was approved and paid out the next day, in one day, on a fraud, on Christmas Eve. So Sergei figured it out, that the whole purpose of this scam was to steal the money that we had paid in taxes. And now this was a big discovery for us, because we assumed, and you probably assume as I'm telling you the story, that Putin wouldn't have been happy with this. This wasn't our money that was being stolen. This was the Russian government's money that was being stolen. Putin is supposed to be a patriot and a nationalist. Why would he be happy with his own government's money being stolen? And so we figured this must be a rogue operation. There's no way that they would have authorized this. And so we thought, okay, Russia's a corrupt place, a lot of mid-level and low-level guys doing corruption. We're going to expose them to the top guys and let the top guys, come down like a ton of bricks.
Right.
And so we put all the information out there, told the story to all the newspapers and radio and TV. We wrote criminal complaints to every different law enforcement agency in Russia. And then Sergei gave a sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI.
Okay.
And then we sat back and said, let's watch the good guys get the bad guys now.
Little did you know.
And there, in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys.
Right.
Instead of arresting the people who stole the $230 million, the people who stole the $230 million arrested Sergei Magnitsky 5 weeks after he testified against them, the same exact people. They threw him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor, and the sewage would bubble up. They moved him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against these corrupt police officers.
Right.
And they wanted him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And they figured, here's this guy. He's a lawyer. He wears a blue suit and a red tie and a white shirt, works out of a fancy American law firm, buys Starbucks in the morning. They figured this guy, they figured that this guy will just, you lean on him and you'll testify against anybody. And they completely misjudged Sergei Magnitsky. He was a man of just incredible integrity and principle. And for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was just more painful than the physical pain they were subjecting him to. And he refused. And so the torture got worse and worse and worse. And after about 6 months of this, he started to have terrible pains in his stomach. He ended up losing 40 pounds, and he was diagnosed in the prison infirmary as having pancreatitis and gallstones. And he needed an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. And so about a week before the operation, they came to him again asked him to sign this false confession. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had a medical wing to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is, for anyone who knows Russian prisons, considered to be one of the most awful prisons in Russia. It's most significantly for Sergei, who was sick, they had no medical facilities there. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into a terrible downward spiral. He was in constant agonizing pain. And at Butyrka, they completely banned him from having any kind of medical treatment. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different formal requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. And every one of those requests was either ignored or denied in writing.
Right.
And he, about, 5 weeks later, he went into critical condition. And on November 16, 2009, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. And so they put him in an ambulance while he was in critical condition, sent him to a different detention center that had a medical wing. But when he arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. He was 37 years old. That was 12 years ago.
And so obviously a terrible, awful story. And this was a man who was fighting on your behalf, doing the investigation, and then protected you and stood up for the right thing and didn't bear false witness. But most people, the tragic story, would chalk it up to a horrible event and mourn him, and maybe set up a fund for his family or whatever it might be, or a fund in his name, and educate some people and go on. You didn't do that. What did you do and why?
Well, for me, I just it was an unforgivable crime. I mean, it was just so heinous. And first of all, he was killed because he is my proxy. He would be he'd still be alive today if he hadn't worked for me. And just the arrogance and the I mean, just that they could do this to somebody. I mean, he was really just the best guy, and to just torture him to death. I mean, I just couldn't live with it. I mean, it was just it was just unforgivable. And
Right.
everybody has their own way of dealing with this type of adversity. For me, the idea of just letting it go is just not going to happen. I had to do
Right.
something.
Right.
And I
And
made
what was that? Yeah. What did you do? Yeah.
I made a vow to his memory, to his family, to myself, that I was going to put aside everything else I was doing, and I was going to devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And that's what that's what I've done. And now I'm not a lawyer by training.
Right.
I didn't know anything about getting justice.
Right.
But and when I started looking around to see what kind of justice one could get, I discovered that there are no mechanisms to get justice.
At least
Uh,
not in Putin's Russia. Right.
no, I mean in the West. I mean, so I mean, first of all,
Oh,
in Russia,
right.
they were not going to give us justice, so
Of course.
they completely circled the wagons.
Right.
They exonerated everybody involved. Putin personally got involved in the cover up.
Okay.
And so I said, we need to get justice in the West. But then I started looking around in the West, and I say, okay. And as a non-lawyer, I'm not trained as a lawyer.
Right.
I went to the European Court of Human Rights to see what they're up to, and I discovered that the European Court for Human Rights, which has jurisdiction over Russia, they issue decisions against the country, not against any individuals.
Right.
And it takes about 10 years to get a decision. And when you get a decision, they award 50,000 euros. Thank you very
Right.
much. That's not
And
justice.
no power beyond that, and no real authority beyond that.
Then I buttonholed the chief justice of the International Criminal Court at the World
Okay.
Economic Forum in Davos.
Yep.
And I told him the story, and he said, "That's a terrible, sad story, Mr. Browder, but you need 100,000 dead if you want to come to our court." And then I found a famous former war crimes prosecutor named David Crane, who was professor at the Syracuse University Law School, and he
Right.
ran a center called Impunity Watch, and he got his students to look at all countries that have something called universal jurisdiction, which is
Right.
which is a concept that says that you can sometimes, if a crime is terrible enough, you can try that crime, or you have jurisdiction over that crime in a foreign country.
Even though it wasn't committed in your country.
Correct.
Right.
And it's a concept that exists on paper, but I wanted to know how he could do it in reality. And so he had his students look at each country, one student per country or whatever, and they discovered that basically it just existed on paper. It was not a real concept.
Okay.
I mean, there's very, very narrow opportunities to use that.
Right.
Either the perpetrator or the victim has to live in that country, et cetera.
Right.
And so the only the only tool that one had at that point in time was to go to your government, go to the U.S. government, go to the British government, go to the European Commission,
Right.
and get them to issue a statement saying, we're very disappointed that they tortured Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was the
really strongly worded letter.
Right. And so that was it. And that that was not going to do it for me.
Okay.
And so I said, okay, if we can't get if there's no laws that exist, then we need to make one.
Okay.
And so then the question
And
is,
how does a finance guy who manages money go about making laws? I mean, you're not elected to Congress, you're not in the political system, how does that work?
Well, it helps that I'm not in Congress and that I'm a finance
Okay.
guy. And I'll tell you why it helps, because as a finance guy, I looked at this whole thing and I said, this is all about money. They killed Sergei
Okay.
Magnitsky for money. They killed
Yeah.
him for $230 million. And I also, as a finance guy, I know that those guys who killed him and took that money, they don't keep it in Russia. They keep that money in Swiss banks, and they buy properties on the French Riviera,
Right.
and they send their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan, and their kids to boarding school in Switzerland, and so on and so forth. And so it was obvious that we had some, there was one place we could get them, which is on their foreign money and their foreign travel. And that's something that we do have jurisdiction over. They're not, the visa is not a right, it's a privilege, and same thing as using the financial system. And so I said, let's freeze their let's try to freeze their assets and ban their visas. And maybe it's better that I wasn't an elected politician or anything, because I didn't know anything, so I had this grand vision without without anybody telling me it couldn't be done.
It's not politically feasible. Nobody's going to do this. There's too many problems with the U.S. relationship with Russia, and you're going to make it monkey it all up. And no member of Congress is going to put themselves out there for one guy in one prison. Yeah, it's horrible and awful and unfortunate, but what are you going to do?
But so because I wasn't constrained by the sort of realities of life, I went to Washington, and I told the story first to a Democratic senator from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin. And then I told it to a Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain. And I said, can we freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And these guys were so moved by the story that they said, yeah, we can. That's what we do here. We make laws. We make
laws that allow you to, bar visas and freeze assets. That's a thing.
And so they in October of 2010, about a year after they killed Sergei, after the Russians killed Sergei, these two senators, along with Senator Roger Wicker and Joe Lieberman, were the original co-sponsors of a piece of legislation called the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which at that point in time just applied to Sergei Magnitsky, nobody else.
Right. And so to be clear, though, the historical thing, right, when you're talking about sanctions and these types of penalties, they're typically against nation states, and they're typically about, trafficking in nuclear weapons, right, or terrorism, or this idea of human rights and accountability and one person in a jail cell and individual Russians, right? This is not normally a thing, is it?
No, not at all. But again, that's the beauty of it. So instead of going after a whole country, which is very hard to do, and very rare, you have to have, like, the country has to be a total pariah state before anyone's going to sanction the whole country, and rightfully so as well, because when you sanction a whole country, most of the people in the country are victims of the regime, not the perpetrators.
Right.
And so this is the idea of just sanctioning a very narrow group of individuals who did something terrible. And that's, so you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can do diplomatic relations with Russia and sanction some of their people, and that's perfectly reasonable. So they put this law on the books, and immediately their phones lit up in Washington. They started getting calls from Russia saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they care about more than anything.
They care about sending their kids to school. They care about traveling abroad. They care about sending their, wives, girlfriends, whatever it might be, on shopping trips. They care about keeping access to their money in their Swiss banks, right? Yeah. They're not happy. And
in fact, they care about that more than anything. That they value cash more than human life.
Right.
And so these Russians started saying, you found it. By the way, can you sanction the people who killed my brother, my husband, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these senators realized that they were onto something much bigger than just Sergei Magnitsky, that this was like really, they sort of stumbled into an amazing policy tool.
Right.
And so they added 65 words to the Magnitsky Act to include all human rights abusers in Russia.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I wasn't by myself advocating on Capitol Hill. Every other victim of human rights abuse in Russia was there, telling their stories, talking to their contacts, working with their organizations. And by the time it went for a vote, it passed the Senate 92-4 in November of 2012. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And I should point out that at the time that this was happening, President Obama was the president,
right?
And he didn't want to do this. He had a different idea. He wanted to make nice with the Russians. He had something called the Russian Reset, which was completely ill-advised and made no sense and unrealistic based on who was over there.
Right. I mean, famously, he had that aside with Putin where he said, "You just got to get me through the election, right? And we can deal with some of these issues." And yet, here we are. So keep going with the story.
And so he tried stopping it at every step of the way, and he really was very, very grudging in signing into law. But
threatened to veto, but you had veto-proof majorities in both houses. Had he vetoed it, you had enough votes to override it, and he signed it sort of unwillingly.
He signed it unwillingly, and that's the beauty of the American system. And I've been working on Magnitsky Acts around the world, and very rarely do you have this separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch, where the legislative branch is a co-equal branch of government. Right. If you can get 92 senators to support a law, it doesn't matter what the president thinks or wants. And we got that. And so the law passed. And Obama had even made promises to Putin, don't worry, I'll handle this.
I'll take care of this. Right.
And he didn't handle this. And Putin was shocked. He's like, well, how can that be that
you're the president?
Of course you could handle it. And so Putin really he got very emotional. And there's a press conference right after the Magnitsky Act passed, and you could just see he was like really just spitting venom, and just so angry with me personally, and calling me a criminal, and calling Sergei Magnitsky a criminal, and he then in retaliation banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families.
It's a huge issue. A lot of people want to go to Russia and get these children, and it's been a huge thing for American couples.
It's a huge thing both for the Americans and for the orphans. So the Russians don't put up orphans for adoption who are healthy. The healthy ones go to Russians. The ones for foreigners are the ones with Down syndrome, with HIV, with fetal alcohol syndrome, and all these other terrible things that happen to orphans in a difficult country like Russia. And so, but Americans would show up year after year in the thousands to adopt these sick children, and they would bring them back to America and give them good medical care. And these children would survive and thrive and had meaningful lives. If they stayed in Russia, which they then did after this ban, the orphanages didn't have the resources to give them that medical care. And so in some cases, in many of these cases, these children didn't survive until the age of 18. And so effectively, what Putin was doing with this adoption ban was killing his defenseless orphans in retaliation for the US sanctioning his corrupt officials. And he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And he thought that everybody would be intimidated, maybe it would get walked back or not implemented or whatever. But his emotional meltdown had just the opposite reaction. From Congress.
Got worse, actually, as it turns out.
So what happened was
worse for him,
and worse for all the other dictators of the world, because
around the world.
Because Senator Cardin and Senator McCain said, well, wait a second, if Putin is having this meltdown, I'm sure there's a lot of other worthy dictators that should be having a similar type of meltdown. Let's make this global. And so they introduced the Global Magnitsky Act, which then 4 years later, in December of 2016, passed both houses of Congress and became a federal law. And that applied to human rights violators everywhere, not just in Russia. And now at this point, I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is good, but these bad guys could easily just, skip America. They can go to, Canada or wherever, and Europe. And so so we needed to get the Magnitsky Act passed in other countries. But the problem of getting laws passed in other countries modeled on an American law is that there's a lot of anti-Americanism out there in the world.
Sure.
A lot of people don't want to do, a lot of people, America is a powerful country. People don't like powerful countries. People, in some cases, don't want to follow what America is doing.
Right.
And so I needed to get a sort of neutral country to pass the Magnitsky Act so that it wasn't just an American concept.
Right. Then they could point to somebody else. Right.
And so I went to Canada. And
everyone likes the Canadians.
Well, they either like the Canadians, but there's no such, they don't dislike the Canadians.
Right.
That's for sure. So there's no such thing as anti-Canadianism. There's anti-Americanism, but
right.
no one's anti-Canadian.
Right.
And the Canadians passed the Canadian Magnitsky Act in October of 2017. Unanimously, they passed it in their House of Commons, and then the next day in their Senate, and then it was signed into law. And once the Canadians passed the Magnitsky Act, that set off a whole sort of tidal wave. I mean, everybody wanted, then everybody could do it.
Right.
Following that, the British Parliament passed the British Magnitsky Act in 2018. And we also had, in the meantime, a Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian Magnitsky Act. After the British passed their Magnitsky Act, then you had a Jersey, Gibraltar, Cayman Islands, Guernsey Magnitsky Act. And then finally, Europe was the big prize. And in December of 2020, after really a hard slog, because in Europe, all it takes is one country in the European Union to say no, and then they can't do it. It requires unanimity. And for the longest time, Hungary, which is a big, run by a guy named Viktor Orban, big friend of Putin, he was just basically doing Putin's work by blogging. And it was only because of the intervention of Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi.
Right.
And so Orban didn't really care what people around him in the European Union thought, but he cared very profoundly about what Republicans thought of him.
Why?
And it was this whole sort of, he needed the support of, he has a whole sort of right-wing thing going, and he needed the support of people.
The Trump crew.
And not just the Trump crew, but just Republicans generally.
Yeah. Right.
And Roger Wicker cares profoundly about the Magnitsky Act, and he said, and it was in November of 2020, he called up the Hungarian ambassador and said, I'm about to go publicly to war with Viktor Orban over his blocking of the Magnitsky Act. They said, whoa, hold on a second. And a week later, he dropped his block. And then the Europeans announced that they were going to do a Magnitsky Act. And so we now have, if you include the 27 member states of the European Union, Canada, the United States, UK, that gets you to 31. 31. Yeah. Yes. And then you also have, strangely out of nowhere, Kosovo and Montenegro have a Magnitsky Act. And now Australia has made the public announcement they're going to have a Magnitsky Act. New Zealand will be quickly. New Zealand is a country which is ranked number 1 in Transparency International's sort of honesty index, and it will be the one sort of civilized country that doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. So they'll be quick on Australia's heel. Then we have Japan, who's got stuff going, and Taiwan. And so, and the idea is basically to get every country in the world where people want to keep their money. I mean, you don't have to have every country in the world, just where people want to keep their money. Rule of law countries where people want to keep their money safe. Because if you close those places off, it basically, makes it impossible to function.
Right.
And so, yeah, sure, they can keep their money in China. Good luck to, North Korea. Good luck on that.
Well, let me ask you this, Bill. So I do want to take questions from the audience, and so audience members, if you have questions, go to put them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them here in just a second. But I want to understand something. We've seen in the last few years, and in particular in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen Vladimir Putin come out very aggressively against his enemies. Right? We've seen Alexander Litvinenko, Sergei Skripal, right? Alexei Navalny just recently. I mean, Putin's going around the world and sending teams to poison people in Western countries. I mean, this is a thing, right? And he's clearly no fan of yours. He killed your lawyer. That's got to weigh on you. Talk to us about that.
Well, they've been going after me so basically since the Magnitsky Act was passed. They've been, he's used the full, weight and force of the Russian government to go after me in every possible way, legally, extra legally, etc. They, the first thing that happened was they issued a red notice for my arrest from Interpol. Hence,
and a red notice is an international arrest warrant.
Correct.
Yeah.
And Interpol is not supposed to be doing the bidding of dictators, but Interpol is kind of like the United Nations. They kind of treat everybody equally and give everyone mutual respect and so on. And so it required a big legal intervention to stop that.
Right.
And then they went back to Interpol, and then back again and back again. They've been to Interpol 8 times to have me arrested. I was arrested a couple of years ago in Madrid when I was on my way to meet with the chief anti-corruption prosecutor in Madrid on his invitation to give evidence about Russian money laundering connected to the Magnitsky case in Spain. And so he wants to investigate the dirty money in Spain that comes from these people. And then the same people somehow orchestrate for me to be arrested before I go to my meeting with him on an Interpol warrant in Spain. And thankfully, I had access to my phone. I tweeted out I was being arrested. And by the time I got to the police station, there was such a storm of indignation that they let me go. But I was arrested. I was detained in Geneva, all sorts of stuff. So basically, they're trying to have me extradited from the UK. Mm-hmm. I was warned back in, I think it was 2015, that there was a rendition that the US government had picked up on their intelligence networks, that there was an illegal rendition plot, a kidnapping plot being put together to try to have me kidnapped and taken back to Russia. I'm surveilled. I've been sued numerous times. I'm currently being sued right now by a Russian emigre in Washington, D.C. for libel, for calling him a former GRU officer when he put it in his resume that he was a GRU officer. I'm being sued in libel for that. I was sued in libel by a police officer in the UK. I've been sued in the UK for various things. I've been sued in Russia. The amount of energy these people put into going after me both legally and extra legally is pretty enormous.
Yeah, but what about, and so I get the lawsuits and the arrests and the like, but I mean, do you worry that your doorknob, your cup of tea? I mean, is this and how do you think about it? How do you deal with that? I mean, these are the tools that Vladimir Putin uses against his enemies.
Yeah, well, I don't drink tea with strange Russians.
Fair enough.
I've got to be careful who I associate with. I have to be careful where I go. I've got to, got to be careful where I travel. I've got to, it's, how do you deal with that? You deal with it the same way you deal with every other risk that you face in life. I mean, I could be killed any day by the Russians. You could be killed by COVID any day. I mean, the whole world has joined me in this mortal fear thing that I was experiencing by myself before. I mean, it's, what it does do is it makes you appreciate every day a lot more, because you don't know when your last day is going to be.
Yeah. Well, so Bill, I've got some questions from the audience. Let me jump to those, and then we can circle back. So Gentry Lane, one of our visiting fellows, asked about cryptocurrency. Right? Are the oligarchs using cryptocurrency to get around what you've been doing with the Magnitsky Act across the globe? And what about Malta? Is there an effort there in Malta? And is that an out for these oligarchs?
So cryptocurrencies. So if you want to take out, so the banking system used to be, you could go to a Swiss bank, you could withdraw $1 million, put it in a suitcase, go to a different Swiss bank, put it into the account, and no one would ever know where the money was, and that was like true money laundering. Mm-hmm. Since then, the authorities have said, well, we can't allow that, and so anytime someone takes out more than $10,000, you can. You have to fill out a form and disclose it to the regulator. Right. And it's pretty tough. And if you want to set up an account, they need to see all your passport and your utility bills and all this kind of stuff. And they got to know your customer. It's pretty serious stuff.
Right.
With cryptocurrencies, you can move $10 million with the stroke of a keystroke, and nobody's going to know. well, it's not necessarily true that nobody's going to know, but more or less, I mean, that's the idea.
Right.
And so for all you cryptocurrency lovers out there, just think about this, that why would a bank regulator allow that to happen when they don't allow you to take $10,000 of cash out of your bank account?
Right.
And the answer is they won't. They're just slow. And so if anyone thinks that this cryptocurrency thing is going to be, this libertarian mecca for, whatever, it ain't. The governments will all get to it because they don't want to allow they don't want to allow this stuff to they don't want to allow money laundering to be bypassed with cryptocurrency. It's just not gonna it's just not gonna be possible. And and so I mean I watch all they get the price of Bitcoin goes up because Gary Gensler says something or whatever, but it's let me tell you, when it's all the chips are down, it'll be fully regulated, and maybe maybe cryptocurrencies will have some purpose as smoother, faster, cost-free transactions. But as far as this idea that you can just move money around the world without anyone knowing, that's just not going to happen. And then Malta, Malta is a really interesting story. Malta is really like Russia in the European Union. I mean, it's a and Russians love Malta because for €1 million, or maybe it's 2 million, you could basically buy a passport, a European Union passport. I'm close friends with the Kariuna Galizia brothers. There are three brothers who are the sons of Daphne Kariuna Galizia, who is a journalist who exposed the president and prime minister and all the major people in Malta of corruption, and in retaliation she was murdered in a car bomb, and all sorts of people are going down. The government has fallen because of that. It's a really ugly little place.
So and Gentry, I should note, is a crypto critic, right? And she thinks you're a badass for what it's worth. Herschel Cantor asks about when you Google Bill Browder, right? There's a lot of stuff about you being a fraud and not a truth teller and the like. It talks about this web campaign against you. Talks about what's going on there and how you deal with sort of that part of this effort against you.
Well, basically, so it's really easy. So I encourage all of you to do an experiment tonight or today, which is say something nice about me on Twitter.
See what happens.
So there's like, and it may take, there may be a delay because it's like midnight in St. Petersburg right now.
Right.
But there's like a whole troll factory, and there's a whole corner of some floor where they devote
at the Internet Research Agency.
Right, exactly, where they devote to Bill Browder and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they make movies. They've made like 6 documentaries, primetime documentaries in Russia about me.
Stop.
They claim that I stole all the money that the IMF was sending to Russia. They claim that I murdered Boris Berezovsky. I murdered Edmund Safra. I murdered Sergei Magnitsky. I murdered. I mean, these guys are. I mean, it's just they're not very good at it, to be honest.
Right.
I mean, it's so. And what they hope is that people. They just take some of the stuff at face value, but nobody does. I mean, it's not like I've ever been uninvited somewhere because someone read some article about me or whatever. And so I mean, it's just I mean, it's interesting because younger people, when they read about themselves on Twitter, I've got a very smart 24-year-old son, and he's an entrepreneur and he's got a nice business, and he reads something on Twitter. He sent me something on Twitter. Someone said something bad about him today, and it's like you have to get used to it, because if you're doing something significant, there are going to be lots of people trying to tear you down, and particularly if you do something against the Russians.
Right. So Barbara Luce asks, do you see parallels what you saw in Russia going on in terms of what's going on in China, right? With the intensifying crackdown on those tech executives who've gotten out of line. And those who pose a threat to the regime. Do you see similar concerns there? And how would global Magnitsky, if at all, apply? This goes beyond our question, but apply in that context. Are there opportunities to use global Magnitsky there?
So for many years, I said, don't invest in China. Why shouldn't you invest in China? Because there's no rule of law in China. And if there's no rule of law in China and you get ripped off, there's no court you can go to adjudicate it. There's no free press you can go to put your. So you're just basically flying by the seat of your pants, hoping that somebody's going to treat you nicely.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's a nationalist country, and when there's a lot of money involved, they probably won't treat you nicely. And then you add on the layer of what the government, the government has their own policies, and they don't care about foreigners making money in the stock market. They don't even care about Chinese making money in the stock market. They care about what they care about. And we're seeing, I think, just the beginning phase of the ugliness of China in terms of how they're dealing with their stock market, and it's absolutely comparable to Russia. The only difference is that they're not so brazen in how they steal. The Russians, everything is about stealing. In China, they actually have what they consider to be their national interest when they do some of this stuff. And so it's not all about stealing. And about your question about global Magnitsky has now been used by everybody together, by all the countries, Canada, the United States, UK, EU, on the Chinese officials setting up the concentration camps to imprison Uyghur people in Xinjiang.
Yes.
And it's been a really good application of the global Magnitsky Act.
Yeah.
I mean, it's and it really upset the Chinese, which is helpful. However, it's hard to even equate 4 people having their assets frozen and visas banned against millions in a concentration camp. But it's a good way to start, and it's a good way to signal the world's disapproval. And the Chinese, judging by the shrill reaction of the Chinese, that's really
So one of our attendees asked, in terms of when we're thinking about Russia and Russian aggression, what should we be most concerned about? Should we be concerned about what they're doing in cyber? Should we be concerned about what they're doing in outer space? We know that there's been talk about Russian weaponry in outer space, intelligence collection, hybrid warfare, the sort of little green men in Ukraine, Arctic operations. I mean, the Russians are getting, they're getting out there quite a bit. That doesn't even mention all the disinformation and misinformation that's taken place over the years. What to you, what is the most concerning aspect of Russian behavior out there in the world today? And what would you, if you were advising American officials on what to be concerned about today, what would it be when it comes to Russia?
Everything. I mean, so basically, just think about this. So Russia has an economy the size of the state of New York. Their military budget is 90% less than the U.S. military budget. Yeah. So they can't compete economically and they can't compete militarily. And so what do? They do all the stuff that they can compete, the asymmetric stuff, which doesn't. And so how do you respond to asymmetric stuff? The way you should respond is with a ton of bricks. You come down on them with a ton of bricks, so they understand that the cost of doing this stuff is so painful that they just go someplace else to play. Putin is a guy who will do anything and everything until he's stopped. But he's not a powerful man. He's a bullshitter, really. He's out there, kind of playing poker with a pair of twos when we have a full house.
Right.
But as long as we allow that to happen, then he'll continue to get away with it.
Yeah. What about what's going on in Afghanistan right now? Right? Do we see a tool? Can Magnitsky be a tool to address? Obviously, the Taliban are now in power. People are deeply concerned about what's about to happen there. Right? The plight of women, the plight of all those Afghan allies, tens of thousands who fought alongside our soldiers, who translated for us, who we made commitments to. What should we be? How should we be thinking about that? How should people who are concerned about that? There are a lot of us are out there trying to get Afghans out. Veterans, men and women who serve in the military, human rights activists. It's a huge problem. There are going to be some of those people, a large number probably, left behind. As much as we try to get them out, how should we think about it? Is there a Magnitsky equivalent that we can be thinking about? Is there something that that we can be thinking about pressuring the U.S. government to do today, globally, to really put pressure on the Taliban and one, to get those people out, and then two, to address those issues that are almost certainly to crop up, even though we've now got the media savvy Taliban. They're still who they are, and we know what they're going to do. They're just going to do it in a more quiet way, as you point out with the Chinese. How should we think about this problem?
I mean, it's just, I mean, it dwarfs of just about every other problem we have right now. It's just the most heinous. It's probably one of the biggest policy debacles I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I've never seen something so bad with such dire consequences to so many people in so many situations and so many second, third, fourth, and fifth order effects that are going to come from this. I mean, it's just, it's just inconceivable how bad this is, and the cost of not having this was just keeping 5,000 troops there. I mean, it's just inconceivable. I've never seen such a bad situation, and I wish I had some kind of Magnitsky, like, I mean, it's it's so bad. I mean, and there's and I mean, there's going to be so many hostages, so many dead people, so many heartbreaking situations over and over and over again. Not to mention, those are the ones we'll know about. So, I wish I had something good to say about that. I wish I had something smart to say. It's truly like heartbreaking and makes with the Magnitsky, I feel like there's something I can do. There's something powerful that I can work on. But I have no idea where to start on this Afghanistan thing, and it's just so horrible.
Well, look, this has been a great conversation. We're down to our last minute, and I just say, look, you've demonstrated, right, that one person can have a massive impact on advocating for these issues, changing the situation that we face, changing laws, not just the United States, but around the globe, and really, getting justice for Sergei Magnitsky and for other people who have been abused by human rights abusers around the globe, including in Russia, but now globally. And so thank you for what you've done. And I think it's a heartening moment. What you're saying is exactly right. The situation we face in Afghanistan is horrific. It's a problem in a lot of ways of our own creation. It is not intelligence failure. It is not a failure of planning or the like. It is a failure of policy and policy execution. And we still have an opportunity, though, to change that. Even in this moment, as bad as it is, we have an opportunity. So for those of you out there who are thinking about what you can do and how you can contribute to solving this problem, Bill is a great example of the fact that one person can, in fact, have an impact. So with that, thank you to you, Bill. Thank you to our audience. Remember, we've got the second part of our 4-part series on antitrust and national security and tech companies, September 23rd at 1 p.m. Check out papers on our website, including about China's oppression of the Uyghurs, U.S. tech innovation policies, pandemic, the intelligence community. Find us on LinkedIn, Twitter. See us at Mason NatSec, and always check out our podcast, Fault Lines, Iron Butterfly, NSI Live. Bill, thanks to you again. Thanks to the audience. Everybody have an amazing evening. Good night.